The remote mountain territory, a lone cabin surrounded by endless wilderness where winter stretched longer than mercy itself. Silas Brennan had discovered something that shouldn't exist during his 4th year in these peaks. The bears had tested his invisible barrier for an entire winter season, yet none had crossed the mysterious line that protected his cabin. When he stepped outside that morning to check his traps, the familiar sight greeted him. 4 massive shapes circling at exactly 30 yards, held back by something they couldn't understand. The method that created this protection had already proven itself through one brutal winter, but the real test would come when the second winter brought new challenges. What made this barrier impossible wasn't just that it worked, but how he'd discovered it by complete accident. Silas pressed his back against the cabin wall, watching the largest bear rise on its hind legs just 30 yards away. The creature's massive head swayed from side to side, nostrils flaring as it tested the morning air. 3 smaller bears flanked it, their dark eyes fixed on the cabin, where the scent of cured meat hung thick from the rafters inside. His entire winter's supply of provisions lay within those walls, enough food to keep him alive until the spring thaw opened the mountain passes again. The bears had appeared 2 weeks ago, and nothing he tried worked the way it should. Fire didn't drive them off. Loud noises only made them retreat temporarily before returning with greater boldness. Even the wolf urine he'd collected and spread around the perimeter seemed to lose its power within hours. Every morning brought the same terrifying sight, massive paw prints pressed deep into the snow, circling closer to his door. Silas had lived in these mountains long enough to read animal behavior like other men read newspapers. Bears this persistent meant only one thing. They'd identified his cabin as their primary food source and wouldn't abandon the hunt until they claimed what they wanted. The problem was, winter had sealed every escape route. Snow blocked the passes, and his nearest neighbor lived 4 days' ride through terrain that would claim his life before he traveled half the distance. He watched the alpha bear drop back to all fours and begin pacing along the same invisible boundary that seemed to confuse all of them. The animal's massive head swept back and forth, testing something in the air that Silas couldn't detect himself. Whatever kept them at bay remained a complete mystery to him, but he knew the protection wouldn't last forever. The temperature was dropping again, and hungry animals grew desperate when survival was at stake. Silas had seen what bears could do to cabins when starvation drove them past normal caution. Thick wooden walls became matchsticks under claws designed to tear through tree bark and stone. But something was different about the way these bears behaved. They wanted inside, but something invisible held them back, creating a barrier that shouldn't exist. And Silas was about to discover that the most impossible solutions sometimes came from the most unexpected places. It had taken him most of the previous winter to understand what protected his cabin. 12 months ago, when the first family of bears had appeared, Silas had tried every traditional method he knew. Fire, noise, even wolf urine spread around the perimeter. Nothing worked for more than a few hours before the hungry animals returned with greater boldness. The answer had come by accident during a violent snowstorm in late January. He'd been checking his root cellar when he noticed something odd about bear tracks in the snow. They approached his cabin in perfect straight lines from different directions, but all stopped at the exact same distance, 30 yards. Like an invisible wall surrounded his home. That discovery led him to examine his property more carefully. Buried beneath the snow were several glass jars he'd forgotten about, containers holding a failed experiment from the previous autumn. He'd been trying to create a natural meat preservative, combining rendered skunk fat, fermented fish bones, concentrated pine tar, and crushed wild garlic. The smell had become so revolting he'd buried the mixture to get it away from his living space. But the frozen ground hadn't sealed the odor completely. Throughout the winter, the concentrated mixture had been slowly releasing into the air, creating an invisible barrier that triggered every survival instinct the bears possessed. To their sensitive noses, the combination smelled like contaminated territory, warning them away from what they interpreted as a place of death. Once Silas understood the science behind his accidental protection, he began improving the system. He learned exactly how much of each ingredient created the most effective deterrent. He discovered that glass jars buried at specific depths released the odor at the perfect rate. Most importantly, he figured out the precise placement pattern that used wind currents to maintain a consistent barrier around his entire property. That first winter had been his testing ground. He'd refined the mixture, adjusted the positioning, and weathered multiple bear challenges. By spring, he'd created something that seemed impossible, a reliable, renewable protection system based entirely on natural chemistry and animal psychology. Now, as his second winter approached, Silas faced a new challenge. Word had spread somehow among the wildlife. More bears were coming, including younger animals who hadn't learned to fear his invisible boundary. His impossible scent barrier had worked perfectly for one full winter, but maintaining it through a second season would require everything he'd learned about survival, chemistry, and the instinctive behavior of the mountain's most dangerous predators. Spring had taught him valuable lessons about maintaining his system. As the snow melted and temperatures rose, Silas discovered that the effectiveness of his barrier changed with the weather. Warmer temperatures released the scent faster, requiring him to adjust the concentration. Rain diluted the mixture, forcing him to develop better sealing techniques for his buried containers. Throughout the summer months, he perfected his formula. The key was balance. Enough skunk fat to create the base odor, sufficient fermented fish bones to trigger decay instincts, pine tar to make the smell stick in the air longer, and wild garlic to add a sharp, unnatural edge that confused animal senses. Each ingredient served a specific purpose in creating what he now called his impossible barrier. But summer also brought troubling discoveries. Fresh bear sign appeared regularly around his property, and the tracks told a disturbing story. Young bears, probably born the previous year, were testing his boundary with less fear than their elders. They approached closer than the adults, sometimes getting within 20 yards before retreating. Their inexperience with his deterrent made them dangerous in ways he hadn't anticipated. As autumn arrived, Silas prepared for his second winter with methodical precision. He gathered larger quantities of each ingredient, rendered more skunk fat than ever before, and created additional fermentation containers for fish bones. This time, he would be ready for whatever challenges the mountain wildlife could present. The first snow confirmed his worst fears. Not only had the original bear family returned, but they'd brought others. 7 bears now circled his property, including 3 young animals that showed disturbing boldness. The older bears maintained their respectful distance from his invisible barrier, but the younger ones kept testing, probing, searching for weaknesses in his protection. Winter deepened, and the tests became more frequent. The young bears had begun working together, approaching from different directions simultaneously to see if they could overwhelm or confuse his scent barrier. Silas realized he was facing a new kind of intelligence, bears who were learning to adapt to his impossible protection system. One morning in late December, he discovered something that changed everything. Fresh tracks showed that one of the young bears had approached to within 15 yards of his cabin during the night. Somehow, the animal was gradually building tolerance to his deterrent mixture. His impossible barrier was no longer completely impossible to overcome. The second winter was testing his system in ways the first had never challenged. These weren't just hungry bears avoiding a strange smell. They were problem-solving predators who were slowly figuring out how to defeat the very protection that had seemed foolproof just months earlier. Silas would need to evolve his methods faster than the bears could adapt, or his impossible barrier would become a deadly failure. February brought the ultimate test of his impossible system. The young bears had continued building tolerance to his deterrent, and one particularly bold animal had begun approaching during daylight hours, getting closer each day. Silas knew he was facing the moment that would determine whether his scent barrier could truly protect him through 2 complete winters as promised. The crisis came during the worst blizzard of the season. High winds disrupted his carefully calculated scent patterns, creating gaps in the invisible barrier that the bears sensed immediately. All 7 animals moved closer to his cabin simultaneously, testing different sections of his protection as the storm raged around them. Silas worked frantically inside his cabin, mixing his strongest batch yet. He'd learned to create concentrated versions of his original formula, combinations so potent they would overwhelm even partially adapted bear senses. But deploying the mixture in a blizzard meant exposing himself to deadly conditions and 7 increasingly bold predators. The moment came when his cabin door began to rattle. The boldest young bear had reached the structure itself, testing whether the wood would yield under pressure. Silas realized his invisible barrier had failed completely in at least one section, and the animal was discovering that his cabin might not be as protected as it had seemed. He grabbed his most concentrated mixture and burst through the back door, circling around the cabin in the howling wind. The young bear was at his front entrance, massive paws pressed against the door, while 6 others waited in a rough semicircle. They'd finally breached his impossible defense, But Silas had prepared for this moment throughout his second winter. Working with desperate precision, he spread his enhanced deterrent in a tight circle around the cabin, creating a concentrated barrier that hit the wind patterns like an invisible wall. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All 7 bears recoiled simultaneously, backing away from the cabin as if they'd encountered something poisonous. The young bear at his door staggered backward, shaking its massive head and snorting violently. The concentrated mixture was overwhelming even its partially adapted senses, driving the animal back to the safety of the tree line. Within minutes, all 7 bears had retreated beyond their original 30-yard boundary. But this time, they didn't return. Days passed without a single bear approaching his property. Word had somehow spread through the local wildlife population that his territory was permanently contaminated, too dangerous for any predator to challenge. His impossible scent barrier had evolved beyond simple deterrence into something that commanded absolute respect from every animal in the mountains. As spring approached, Silas realized he'd accomplished something remarkable. His accidental discovery had protected him through 2 complete winters, exactly as the mountain men would later claim when they told stories of the impossible barrier that kept bears away through sheer chemistry and human ingenuity. The system had proven itself under every possible condition, creating protection that seemed to violate natural law, but actually worked by understanding it perfectly. Word of Silas Brennan's territory spread through the mountain wildlife network in ways he never anticipated. By March of his second winter, not only had the local bear population learned to avoid his property, but other predators had begun steering clear as well. Wolves, mountain lions, even the bold coyotes that usually scavenged around human settlements now treated his cabin as forbidden ground. The success created an unexpected problem. His invisible barrier had become so effective that it disrupted normal wildlife patterns throughout the entire valley. Animals that had used traditional migration routes for generations now detoured miles around his property. The concentrated scent had evolved beyond simple bear deterrent into something that triggered avoidance instincts across multiple species. Silas discovered this by accident when he ventured beyond his protected zone to check distant trap lines. The forest around his cabin had become eerily quiet, almost empty of animal life, but just beyond the range of his scent barrier, wildlife activity was concentrated at unnatural levels. Deer trails showed heavy traffic where animals were being forced into smaller areas. Predator signs were multiplied in regions that normally saw light hunting pressure. He realized his impossible barrier had created an ecological dead zone. The chemistry that protected him so perfectly was disrupting the natural balance of an entire mountain ecosystem. For the first time since developing his system, Silas faced a moral question that had nothing to do with his own survival. Was his protection worth the environmental cost it was causing? The answer came when he discovered fresh human tracks near his property. Other mountain men had heard stories about the man whose cabin bears couldn't approach. They were coming to investigate, drawn by tales of an impossible protection system that violated every known rule of wilderness survival. Some came seeking knowledge, others came as skeptics determined to prove the stories were exaggerated. Silas watched from concealment as a grizzled trapper approached his cabin boundary. The man walked confidently until he hit the scent barrier, then stopped abruptly. His face contorted in disgust as the concentrated mixture hit his senses. The trapper backed away rapidly, muttering curses about the foul smell that seemed to come from nowhere. But Silas could see the wheels turning in the man's head, trying to understand what created such an effective deterrent. More visitors followed over the next few weeks. Each one tested the boundary, recoiled from the concentrated odor, then spent time examining the area for clues about what created such powerful protection. None of them figured out the buried jar system, but their interest proved that his secret was spreading beyond the animal kingdom. The attention worried him. His impossible barrier worked perfectly because it remained mysterious. The moment other people understood how it functioned, they would either try to duplicate it or find ways to defeat it. Either outcome would end the isolation that had made his mountain life possible. As spring approached and his second winter drew to a close, Silas faced a choice. He could share his discovery and help other mountain dwellers protect themselves, or he could guard the secret and maintain his unique advantage. The decision would determine not just his own future, but whether the impossible scent barrier would remain his alone. The final test of Silas Brennan's impossible barrier came from an unexpected source. Late in March, as winter began its slow retreat from the mountains, a massive grizzly bear appeared at his property line. This wasn't one of the local animals that had learned to respect his invisible boundary. This was a stranger, probably awakening from hibernation in a distant cave system, drawn by the concentrated wildlife activity in areas beyond his scent barrier. The grizzly was enormous, easily twice the size of any bear that had challenged his protection during the previous 2 winters. It approached his cabin with the confidence of an apex predator that had never encountered anything it couldn't dominate through sheer size and aggression. Silas watched from his window as the massive animal crossed terrain where lesser bears had always stopped, showing no sign of detecting the concentrated deterrent that had protected him so effectively. For several terrifying minutes, it seemed his impossible system would finally fail. The grizzly continued forward, massive paws leaving deep prints in the remaining snow, until it reached exactly the same boundary that had held every other predator for 24 months. Then something remarkable happened. The enormous bear's head jerked backward, as if it had struck an invisible wall, nostrils flaring as the concentrated scent hit its senses. The reaction was more violent than anything Silas had witnessed. The grizzly reared onto its hind legs, standing nearly 10 feet tall, then dropped back and retreated faster than seemed possible for such a massive creature. It didn't stop at the tree line like other bears had done. It kept moving, disappearing into the forest with what looked unmistakably like panic-driven flight. That encounter proved something crucial about his barrier system. The concentrated mixture didn't just deter familiar local predators. It triggered such fundamental survival instincts that even the largest, most confident predators would flee rather than challenge his protected territory. His impossible scent barrier had reached a level of effectiveness that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. As the last snow melted and spring established itself in the mountains, Silas made his decision about sharing his discovery. He would teach his method to select individuals, mountain men who had proven themselves capable of using the knowledge responsibly. But he would never reveal the complete formula or precise placement patterns that made his system so devastatingly effective. Over the following months, he shared simplified versions of his technique with 3 trusted neighbors. They learned to create basic scent barriers that provided reasonable protection, but none achieved the absolute effectiveness of his original system. The impossible barrier remained his unique achievement, protecting his cabin through 2 complete winters, exactly as the stories would later claim. The success changed Silas Brennan's relationship with the wilderness permanently. He was no longer just another mountain man struggling to survive in hostile territory. He had become something else entirely, a human being who had solved one of nature's most dangerous problems through observation, chemistry, and patient experimentation. His impossible scent barrier had proven that the right knowledge, applied correctly, could create protection that seemed to violate the natural order while actually working in perfect harmony with it. The legacy of Silas Brennan's impossible barrier would be tested one final time before his second winter ended completely. April brought an unexpected challenge when a traveling naturalist arrived at his property, sent by the territorial government to investigate reports of unusual wildlife behavior in the mountain region. The man introduced himself as Professor William Hartford from the university back east, carrying official documents and scientific instruments that made Silas nervous about keeping his secret. Professor Hartford had spent 3 weeks documenting the strange animal migration patterns around Silas's territory. His notes described the ecological dead zone, the concentrated wildlife activity in surrounding areas, and multiple witness accounts of bears refusing to approach a specific mountain cabin. The professor had come to find scientific explanations for phenomena that local trappers described as impossible or supernatural. Silas faced a dilemma that could change everything. He could reveal his method to a scientist who might study, document, and eventually publish the technique for the world to learn. Or he could maintain his secret and allow the professor to leave with incomplete data, preserving his unique protection, but potentially missing an opportunity to help others facing similar dangers. The decision became urgent when Professor Hartford began conducting systematic tests around Silas's property boundary. The scientist had noticed the precise circular nature of the animal avoidance zone and was methodically sampling soil, air, and vegetation to identify what created such consistent behavior modification across multiple species. His instruments were sophisticated enough that discovering the buried jars seemed inevitable. Rather than wait for exposure, Silas chose revelation on his own terms. He invited the professor inside his cabin and explained his accidental discovery, the chemistry behind his deterrent mixture, and the careful placement patterns that made his barrier so effective. Professor Hartford listened with growing amazement as Silas described 2 winters of perfect protection achieved through applied observation and natural chemistry. The collaboration that followed changed both men's understanding of wildlife management. Professor Hartford helped Silas refine his formula using precise measurements and scientific methods. Together, they documented the exact chemical reactions that made the mixture so effective, the optimal concentration ratios for different weather conditions, and the mathematical placement patterns that created the most efficient barriers. But they also discovered something sobering about Silas's success. His impossible barrier worked perfectly because it was unique in the ecosystem. If multiple mountain dwellers began using similar techniques, the animals would eventually adapt or find ways around the deterrent. The very effectiveness of his system depended on its rarity and mystery. Professor Hartford agreed to keep the complete methodology confidential, publishing only general observations about chemical deterrence and animal behavior modification. Silas would continue using his perfected system, and the professor would return east with scientific data that advanced the field without revealing the specific techniques that had kept bears away from one mountain cabin for 2 complete winters. Their agreement preserved both the science and the secret, ensuring that Silas Brennan's impossible scent barrier would remain an isolated success story rather than a widely duplicated technique that might lose its power through overuse. 2 winters had passed since Silas Brennan first buried those failed jars around his mountain cabin. As spring arrived for the second time since his accidental discovery, he stood in his clearing and surveyed territory that had become the safest place in the entire mountain range. Not a single bear had successfully breached his invisible barrier in 24 months. His impossible scent protection had proven itself under every conceivable condition, from blizzards to droughts, from young bears to massive grizzlies, from local predators to passing strangers. The transformation in his daily life was remarkable. Where once he had lived in constant vigilance, checking sightlines and securing provisions against raids, Silas now moved through his property with complete confidence. His food stores remained untouched, his trap lines stayed productive, and his sleep went uninterrupted by the sounds of large predators testing his defenses. The invisible barrier had given him something no other mountain dweller possessed: absolute peace of mind in hostile territory. But the greatest change was in Silas himself. He was no longer just a man trying to survive in the wilderness. He had become an innovator, someone who had solved a fundamental problem through observation, experimentation, and persistence. The knowledge that his system worked perfectly had transformed his relationship with the mountains from fearful coexistence to confident mastery. His reputation spread throughout the territory despite his efforts to maintain secrecy. Other mountain men spoke in hushed tones about the cabin that bears couldn't approach, the invisible protection that defied every known rule of wilderness survival. Some claimed it was supernatural, others insisted it was impossible, but all agreed that Silas Brennan had achieved something that seemed to violate the natural order. The truth was simpler and more remarkable than the legends. Through careful chemistry, precise placement, and patient refinement, he had created a deterrent system that worked by understanding nature perfectly rather than opposing it. His barrier didn't fight the bear's instincts. It used those instincts to create voluntary avoidance that was more effective than any physical barrier could ever be. As he prepared for his 3rd winter with complete confidence in his protection, Silas reflected on what he had accomplished. His impossible scent barrier had kept bears away for exactly 2 winters, proving itself through every test the mountains could devise. The system would continue working indefinitely as long as he maintained the chemistry and respected the science behind its success. The mountain wilderness that had once threatened his survival daily now felt like a protected sanctuary where he could live and work without fear. Bears still roamed the surrounding forests, but his territory remained inviolate, defended by an invisible wall of scent that commanded absolute respect from every predator in the region. Silas Brennan had taken an accidental discovery and transformed it into a permanent solution, creating protection that seemed impossible, but worked through the practical application of natural chemistry and animal psychology. His impossible barrier had proven that the right knowledge, properly applied, could accomplish what appeared to violate the laws of nature, while actually working in perfect harmony with them. After 2 complete winters of flawless protection, his system had earned its reputation as truly impossible, even though the science behind it was surprisingly simple. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable frontier tale, where courage and ingenuity collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.